And going back to our top story now, African leaders have concluded the protocols to the agreement establishing an Africa free trade area, and the modalities for tariff liberalization. The milestone follows the meeting of AU ministers of trade held in Dakar in Senegal. South Africa, which is one of the signatories to the trade agreement, hails the development as a significant achievement. The country sees tariff liberalization as enabling the creation of commercially meaningful value chains in the continent. Meanwhile, observers say that non-signatories missed out on an opportunity to attract investment in job-creating productive sectors. And now my colleague Harold will further unpack this story.
Thank you, Ananda. We are joined now on the line by Levi Ndo, a political analyst via Skype. Good evening, Levi, and welcome to the show.
Good evening to you. Good evening to the viewers at home.
We are also joined by Professor Achille Mbembe, a research professor at WITS, on the phone line. Good evening, Achille. Gentlemen, and starting with you, Levi, this is quite a momentous occasion, isn't it? This free trade area that is being proposed for the African continent. It is quite significant because it creates a market potentially of 1.2 billion people and possibly $3.4 trillion
Indeed, this is one of the most prestigious decisions that have been taken by African states. You'll recall that with the formation of the regional bodies, your SADC, your ECOWAS, and so on and so on, there has been a proposal for a free trade agreement. And in particular, when you look at SADC, this has been in the lips of the leaders for some time. And in terms of implementation, it has been going on. But I think what then becomes more important is that African countries will then be able, at an economic level, be able to trade with one another and actually ensure that the economy of the continent is actually going to grow. And also at the same time, this opens up a lot of opportunities for all kinds of business, either small or bigger businesses, so that they are able to relate and interact with one another in terms of the trade relations. And indeed, one must actually applaud the decision that has been taken by African states.
What would you think the impact would be in terms of trade itself? It's been suggested that potentially...
Well, if you look in the main, if you look at the investment level, obviously it has got a huge potential for growth in terms of trade. And also at the same time, it creates a situation where the challenges that are being faced by some other countries should actually easily get removed, because there will not be barriers that are actually being created that will prevent other countries trading with one another. But also in the main, you'll recall that the world is moving closer and closer into a very, very small entity. And that then allows all the different states to be able to be active participants in trade relations with other countries. And indeed, it has got a huge potential to benefit the entire continent. Smaller and bigger countries, smaller and bigger businesses are actually going to benefit. And in the main, it has a potential of creating a lot of jobs for ordinary citizens of the African continent.
What should we make of the fact that South Africa and Nigeria, two of the three largest economies on the continent, have not signed on yet? Should we be concerned about that? Is it anything to be worried about?
South Africa is one of the leading countries in SADC. And if you look at the SADC protocols, there is an emphasis of a free trade component, which has to include all the countries that are in the SADC component. And if you look at the non-participant of South Africa and Nigeria, for me, it has to be a serious point of concern. But I think, I would hope that Nigeria and South Africa should actually come to their own senses and actually participate in this important project, which has got a potential of assisting not only the leaders themselves, but also ordinary citizens themselves. And I would hopefully think that they will actually come to the party and be active participants in this entire project.
We've seen African countries sign all sorts of agreements and pacts in history, and many of them really ended up amounting to nothing. In this instance, it's very clear that for this to work, there has to be alignment of policies, regulations, institutions, which is not the simplest thing to do. What do you think will happen this time?
At the same time, for me, different states have to avoid being very, very selfish and actually look at the bigger picture of assisting the entire continent. And of course, countries would have their own policies, countries would have their own ways of doing things. But in the main, I think in the interest of the entire continent and the African citizenry, states are supposed to act in the best interest of the citizens and in the best interest of building a very strong economy in Africa. And I think for me, you need these powerful states to be active participants in projects similar to this one in the interest of Africa and in the interest of the economy of our people and in the creation of jobs and better living standards for everyone.
I'm guessing, Levi, that there probably is cause for optimism. Recently, the African Union unveiled the first phase of the single African air transport market, which is designed to untangle intra-African air connectivity. And as we all know, that's one of the critical impediments to trade and investment and the movement of people across the African continent, isn't it?
It's time for Africa not to rely on the other countries outside Africa for their own development. And for me, initiatives like this one have got a potential of boosting the economy of Africa. There's a potential of bringing all the countries together so that they are able to fight common problems. And for me, I think if Africa has to make a decision that will benefit everyone, this is the right moment for Africa to do so. And I think more other projects or more other activities similar to this one will still have to follow, which must actually benefit all of us in the entire continent.
To what extent would this pave the way to a common African currency? President Ramaphosa mentioned it a while ago. I would imagine it's not the easiest thing to do, because when you look at the EU, for instance, it took them a significant amount of time to get to that point. They started off in, the 1960s, creating the common market and ultimately the euro as a common currency. And that, of course, requires a lot more coordination than just creating a common trade area.
Nothing is impossible. Indeed, as you rightfully said, there has been a view to have a common currency for the entire continent. But then obviously there should be a starting point, and the starting point will be the free trade agreements in which different states are able to trade with one another, being able to understand each other's challenges, and of course then they can start talking about a one currency for the entire continent. For me, it cannot be something much easier to do, but indeed it will require a lot of minds coming together, significant coordination to come together, so that at the end of the day, we're then able to achieve one currency for the entire continent. I want to repeat, it's something that might not be easy, but it is possible as long as there is sufficient coordination, unity and understanding amongst the main role players in this activity.
Just to put it in a bit more perspective in terms of the possible impact and the starting point of this initiative, Africa has the lowest percentage of intra-regional trade in the world at 18%. In contrast, Europe is at 70%, Asia at 45%, Latin America at 35%. So it's patent clear that a small increase even in this 18% intra-regional trade in Africa would have a big impact, wouldn't it?
Indeed, there has been a view by a lot of African leaders in politics and in business who are saying that Africa's problems will require Africa's solutions. And I think it is time for Africans themselves to come with initiatives similar to these ones so that they are able to solve their own challenges themselves. Indeed, we're not actually doing well as compared to other countries, especially countries of the West. But I think we, as a continent, we don't have to sit back and say there is nothing that we can do. And one of the initiatives that one has to start with is actually to start with the free trade activities, see as to whether it does work, and indeed, if it brings in much better results, then we can actually be able to say we are moving a step closer to be the active participants in addressing the challenges that we have as a continent. But indeed, we'll still need a lot of support and learning from other countries, especially in the West. But as a continent and as people, we need to be able to say, let us develop initiatives that must address the challenges that we face so that we don't have to sit back and rely on foreign assistance all the time.
It'll be interesting to see how this develops. The one area that concerns me the most, we spoke about it briefly, the Nigeria-South Africa issue, not having signed up to the agreement. 44 states in all out of the 55 states on the continent signed up, but these two are the most significant of the 55 and of the 44. Nigeria makes a suggestion that they are worried about the dumping of goods in their country, and of necessity that implies the dumping of goods by the stronger economies on the African continent, obviously Egypt and South Africa. Are we seeing the Nigeria rivalry with South Africa playing itself out here again?
Well, there has been this kind of a rivalry between South Africa and Nigeria for some time. And remember, because these are the two countries that have got very strong economies, obviously you will always get some form of competition that is actually happening between the two. There has always been a contestation in the main about who is more dominant or who is more powerful in the African continent. And that is something that cannot easily get eroded. But I think for me, you need to have all African leaders coming together to address the challenges facing Africa. Countries can decide, or they can be very much personal and be very, very selfish. But if it does not assist the entire population, that indeed creates serious, very, very serious problems. But for me, I would love to see a situation where Africa becomes united in dealing with the political problems, in dealing with economic and social problems, and that will be a much step closer towards being active participants in trying to solve the challenges that we actually face as a continent.
Oh, thank you very much, Levi. It was great to have you on the show, and we'll speak again soon.
You're welcome.
Over to you, Ananda.
Thank you so much, Harold. Now, a story that we've run before. U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to impose steel tariffs has put him on a collision course with the country's allies. Now, Trump is imposing 25% steel tariffs and 10% aluminium tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, all of which he had previously exempted. Canada has hit back at Trump by announcing tariffs on dozens of U.S. products. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that Trump's tariffs were totally unacceptable and an affront to a country whose soldiers have fought with and died with their American counterparts. Now, I'd like us to just quickly unpack this story. What are the countries affected, and what is the likely response to this move by the President Trump?
You mentioned Canada. It's a very significant one. something in the order of half of their steel imports go into the United States. And it's not surprising that they're feeling quite offended, frankly, because they've been a very loyal ally of the United States. They've jointly fought wars all over the place for decades now. Canada is one significant one. The EU, obviously, which is another ally. And there's also countries like Mexico, which is half of whose steel imports also goes into the United States. And there's countries like Brazil, and to a lesser extent, even countries like South Africa as well. And the response so far, in terms of the World Trade Organization rules, these countries are entitled to impose counter tariffs that are equivalent to the tariffs the U.S. has imposed on them. So in other words, if there's a $3 billion tariff imposed on Canada on steel, they're entitled to impose a $3 billion tariff in the opposite direction on other goods. And that's exactly what they're doing. So, and then what they're also very careful to do is to attempt to impact the U.S. states that are particularly close to Donald Trump's heart. And it's states such as Michigan and Kentucky and Wisconsin, which voted for Donald Trump in the last elections and are likely to be impactful in the upcoming midterm elections for the Congress. So the tariffs that they impose will be on things like whiskey and soya beans and tobacco and Harley Davidsons and all of that sort of stuff is very dear to the people in the Midwest, but have a very, very strong impact, very negative, adverse impact on jobs in those states, and that's why they target those states.
Yeah, and then now who wins in a trade war like this?
Well, nobody wins, frankly. The U.S. steel and aluminum industries might gain some jobs, but industries that depend on them are likely to lose jobs. And examples are metal fabrication industries, aerospace industry, machinery, cars, things that use steel and aluminum to make. Jobs will be lost in those areas. But on a global level, it's even more profound. What happens is that once everybody starts fighting it out on a trade level, you start to have price increases, trade lessens, global growth drops, and then you start to have mayhem. It has the potential to take us back where we were in 2008 when we had essentially a global meltdown.
Okay, and then now it trickles down to us here in South Africa. How are we affected, if at all?
Well, South Africa is not a significant exporter of steel and aluminum to the United States. To put it in perspective, for steel we had less than 2% of the total, and with aluminum we had less than 1%. But for us, it's quite critical. Our steel industry was already in dire straits. So this really worsens it. The possible impact is something in the order of 3 billion rands worth of exports and probably 7,500 jobs. So it's a significant event. Just one last point. This, by the way, has been tried before by other U.S. presidents. The first one to do it was President Hoover in the 1930s, around the time of the Great Depression, and it's believed that it worsened the Depression. Ronald Reagan tried it in the 80s, and he reversed it as well. In 2002, George Bush also imposed tariffs. And by the way, in all these instances, a lot of the tariffs were actually imposed on their own allies. 2002, they were imposed, it was a disaster, and they were reversed. Every indication now is also that the outcome is going to be the same. It's going to be a complete disaster for all of us, and then they'll ultimately be reversed. Hopefully it won't take too long.
And now, which begs the question on why would Trump then go this route?
That's a very good question. He's a very difficult politician to figure out. But generally, he seems to say something and then believe it. Right? He doesn't figure it out, reason it out, and then pursue the logical conclusion of it. He blurts it out and then he lives it. And this is a case of that once again. But secondly, he also has this base of supporters who believe in this romantic vision of bringing back these dying industries like steel and coal. Because coal is another one that he's very passionate about. He continually talks about bringing back the coal industry. There's this attachment to industries that, quite frankly, in US terms, are totally insignificant. To put it in perspective, the steel and aluminum industries employ less than 200,000 people in a workforce of probably, 130, 140, 150 million people. The industries that fabricate and use steel and aluminium to make other products, in contrast, employ 4 million people. So, again, yes, why is he doing this? Well, you probably could ask that about a lot of things that he does, couldn't you?
I'm sure you would. And that's where we leave it for today. That brings us to the end of Prime Business right here on Prime Time Tonight.